So hey, I'm Sandy Moore, and I could probably retitle this to "And Now for Something Completely Different." I run a group of companies under Segrist Inc. We sell specialty animals to the pet trade and to zoos and aquariums across North America. We're vertically integrated. We farm ornamental fish. We import. I also sell small animals and birds, but that's a small portion of what we do. I've got 6 farms in Florida, production facilities where we raise freshwater ornamental fish. And then we've got 4 distribution facilities where we package and distribute the animals to go to retailers. And I sell a couple million fish a week. I only raise maybe 40 different species, but we import from all over the world. We import from every continent every week except Antarctica. And I'm down to about 450 employees. Walmart exited the live animal category earlier this year, and that caused some staff reduction on our port. So, where to start? Anti-fish keeping initiatives. So, first of all, thank you to Patty for inviting me. I was introduced to Patty about 10 years ago or so by the WPA board, and the messaging she has really, I knew that, while we weren't under attack at that time, that it was coming, because we deal in so many different species. We've got fish in the air 364 days out of the year. Coming from anywhere, and because we're dealing in so many different species, it's obviously coming, even though the animals we have, people don't generally pet them, except if you're me. But we knew that it was coming. So what we have going on right now, we have Foundation Franz Weber, who is against keeping fish in glass prisons. We have PETA going after betta fish, going directly after Petco. They filed, or they didn't file, a law class in Oregon filed suit against Petco, Tetra, and Aqueon to increase the size of the betta enclosures, because saying that small betta enclosures were inhumane. 3 weeks ago, even though Walmart had already exited the live fish category, they put a petition online asking people to sign it to ask Walmart to stop selling bettas because of how inhumane it was. And then last night claimed it as a victory that they'd stopped. In Hawaii, we have a couple of protesters, and really it's two people that are trying to shut down the ornamental fish fishery in Hawaii, which is actually the best managed fishery in the world. And so far they have not been successful, but they're getting closer. And then finally, and this is where we're really very vulnerable, Nat Geo ran a story about fish collection in the wild using cyanide. And that does happen, primarily for food to be consumed by humans. When you go to Asia and you go to some of the restaurants and they have live fish, big live fish, they're usually not collected by nets. They're usually collected by cyanide, and the cyanide stuns them. But the fish do retain that cyanide in their tissues. What we've not been able to do as an industry is to come up with an effective test to make sure that the fish are not collected with that method, even though we have funded a good deal of research to try to figure that out. So what we're doing to combat that, my company and several other companies like mine go to the collection stations where we buy the fish from and shorten the supply chains. So we're making sure that we know the people that are shipping us fish and the people that they're buying fish from. Because even though I can't test the fish for cyanide, I can look at the fisherman and just tell by his skin whether or not he's using cyanide as a collection agent. So the activists that we're challenged with, we have, of course, animal rights groups. We have PETA. PETA is going after us pretty hard. Humane Society of the United States is involved in the lawsuit in Hawaii. Environmental groups, like Center for Biological Diversity on the ESA listings. Regulators and law enforcement. I think Phil Goss could probably attest to the fact that FWC here in Florida maybe has changed a little bit of how they approach our industry. Unfortunately, we get some pressure from academics. And that one for us is a little bit more challenging to deal with because they're people that are generally supposed to be in our camps, but we fight them the most. And then hobbyists and we have people within industry that would say that you should only sell captive raised animals. You shouldn't be collecting animals from the wild to resell them into trade and use that as a marketing advantage when we know on the larger scale that's actually not true. That's not possible, and it sends out an anti-industry agenda. So what they do, the strategies that they use for us is to reduce demand by saying you shouldn't keep live tropical fish, right? You shouldn't imprison live fish. You shouldn't go and see them at public aquariums. Increasing costs. There was legislation introduced in Hawaii a few years ago that said that we needed to pack each individual fish with 1.5 gallons of water. And unfortunately, of course, the consumers, nobody could afford to do that. We have people within industry and outside of industry that say that we shouldn't import any animals from outside of the country because we don't know what kind of pathogens they're going to bring in. All of the pathogens are already here. We shouldn't raise fish on farms in the United States. And then finally, outlaw fish based upon their ability to become established or invasive, even without evidence of doing so. So one of the things we've worked on in the past few years, so this is like one of my life goals, is to be able to possess this fish. This fish is critically endangered in the wild where it's native to, which is in Indonesia. For the past 25 years, they have been farm raised on farms in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, the native range state, and then finally in China. They were listed initially on the Endangered Species Act in 1973, and there's no provision under that act for farm-raised animals. So even though they are traded under CITES throughout the rest of the world, and this fish is obviously with the coloration is a farm-raised fish. This is not a naturally occurring color. So even though they're traded around the world and they're highly valued, and they're proven to be farm-raised, they're microchipped. We cannot possess them in the United States, and for me, this is like, a several $million category. So we have been involved with legislators on the Hill for the SAVES Act to allow the trade of farm-raised animals.
What kind of fish?
It's called an Asian arowana. That one's a super red Asian arowana. Very valuable, and I want one. They get to be about that big, right? And some of them are valued at 6 figures per fish. Yeah. Really, really beautiful fish. And the trade is highly monitored because they are an endangered animal. So bettas, we've been fighting this for a couple years. So bettas, wild bettas come from little rice paddies in Thailand and the Mekong Delta. They come out of little puddles, and their wild version of the fish is a little brown and gray, ugly fish. They've been bred to be a pet fish for over 100 years, and they've been bred to increase their finnage, to have more brilliant coloration, and they're raised by the acre in Thailand and Sri Lanka in pint whiskey bottles that they're packed together, and you get up and walk on them, and they have to go through them daily and change the water and feed them. The animal rights activist, so they're raised in 8 ounces of water for their entire life. The animal rights activist would have you think that they shouldn't be contained in anything less than 2 gallons of water, even though they have a labyrinth organ which serves the same function as your lungs. They can breathe air. They don't need to breathe through their gills. If the animal rights activists were able to convince customers or legislators, we would probably never deal in another betta. 2 gallons of water is 16 pounds of water, and so you would go from having a $5 betta to a $100 fish, and people just won't pay that for those fish. And that's just kind of the incrementalism, I think, that we see in every animal industry. So this is one of my farms. Each of these ponds is about 20,000 gallons, and we raise 25,000 Danios per pond, and we run 2 crops a year. We're on PETA's websites as running a fish mill. And I guess, if according to their definition that must be true, I do raise fish for profit. So in Hawaii, we have these 2 activists. We have Renee Umberger and we have Snorkel Bob. And Snorkel Bob Winter, he runs a company that rents snorkel equipment to the rental car agencies in Hawaii. So when people pick up a car, they can also pick up their snorkel equipment. And he doesn't like the aquarium trade there because he thinks that it has some negative impact to his customers being able to view the beauty of the animals there. So he has gone on a personal attack against us, and he actually was appointed to the Sea Shepherd board. And they've recently got rid of him, but he's extreme. So he made a movie that our companies and also public aquariums had to get ready for this past summer because we didn't know what the impact of having an anti-hobby movie was going to be. We expected it to be bad, and then it turned out to be nothing. I'm grateful for that, but it's still out there. Wild animals belong in the wild. So his problem with it is, and he's only going after the aquarium industry. Food fishermen can do whatever they'd like. They don't believe that aquarium fish should be extracted for our pleasure. And it was alluded to earlier, at the most recent CITES COP meeting, the people and the influence are changing. It is no longer really about the science, and it's no longer really about the stakeholders' involvement or what they would like to have happen. We saw interesting movement on elephant, on large animals, and we know that in the next COP that they're going to put marine ornamental fish under the microscope, regardless of what the range states, how they want to manage them. I should go back to that, I apologize. So under, with Hawaii, we have been working with the government. The fishery of Hawaii has been managed for the past 40 years almost, with trade data, knowing how much is extracted, what species are extracted, in what quantities, what the dollar amount is, and what the environmental impact has been. They've filed suit against the state to shut down the aquarium fishery, and so far have not been successful, but they've come really close. We actually had to get the governor to intervene on it last year. If they are successful in Hawaii, and we think that they might be now that the legislator has said, we have the environmental impact statement that trade funded, but now we need a cultural assessment, because we think that extracting fish for the ornamental fish trade is against the culture of Native Hawaiians. We think that if they're successful with that HSUS International will march that right off to Philippines and Indonesia, which is where the majority of marine fish in trade come from. So overall, we have, it's a big industry with actually not a lot of environmental impact. We think, because most of the data is private, that the ornamental fish trade is valued at $1.5 billion per year. Of that, about 95% of freshwater fish are farm-raised, and 90% of marine fish are wild collected. There's a lot of money invested in having more marine fish being able to be tank raised, but the technology is just not there yet. We think there are about 11.5 million freshwater households and little over 1.5 saltwater households. That slide it's not really, I hope you can get the copy of this presentation afterwards. So the countries or the continents that are shaded in are really where the tropical fish are sold. So it's mostly Europe, North America, and Southeast Asia. And where they're collected tends to be equatorial in emerging nations. So from all those small nations, I think probably the US represents half of all trade for ornamental fish. And this is not bashing the food fishers, because I fully support their ability to do business. If a fisherman is out fishing for food fish, it's worth a little bit over $1,500 a ton. If they're collecting for ornamental fish to extract them and keep them alive, it's almost $600,000 a ton in value. So we extract a lot fewer fish, like 1/1000th of what is extracted for food. And around the world, we do a lot of work with conservation, with trade. So livelihoods, we have, in one of the projects I'll go into it later, Project Piaba, the entire area of the Rio Negro is dedicated to food fishing and to ornamental fish fishing. We invest in captive breeding of endangered and extinct animals in the wild. There are a number of species that wouldn't be in existence if it weren't for the hobby and people dedicated to arking those animals. We do fund a number of conservation boards like Rising Tides Research. We work with SeaWorld across the street to figure out how to breed different kinds of marine fish. And they have their researchers figure it out, and then they give industry the recipe of how to do it and how to make money with it. And then public aquarium and scientific technology. So one of the one of the projects we're working on there, you've seen maybe on CNN or some of the other news networks about a coral bleaching event that's going on right now in the Atlantic, or it's not a bleaching event, it's a viral event. And so we're working with the state and with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Once they have figured out how to spawn those corals, now that technology is coming to industry, and what they've been able to do with a few corals, we're going to be able to do with a few thousand corals, and do reef restoration efforts. So a few years ago, I had always been of the mindset that tank raised is better because they're more socialized, they're used to people. Or that they have long supply chains, and maybe it's better because of that. And then I went on an expedition down to the Rio Negro in Brazil, which is it's a tributary to the Amazon River. And that project is to support the sustainable fishery of the Rio Negro. And I went out on this boat, and I didn't have a cell phone or internet for 2 weeks. And I wasn't really happy about that, but went out there and saw with my own eyes how the effects of my buying decisions have a direct effect on the Amazon rainforest. So when I'm buying wild fish from that fishery, the fishermen there are invested in protecting and maintaining the environment around the areas that they collect fish in. If I am not supporting that fishery, then those fishermen have to go and do logging of the trees in the rainforest. They do gold mining, and that messes up the water. I can't even tell you how much. Cyanide is one of the byproducts of gold mining. They do some really environmentally impactful farming, or they just have to move to the slums of Manaus and figure out how to eke out a living. So using that information, I came back and figured out how to support that fishery, improve the quality of those fish, and actually work closely with AZA. And until that point, industry and AZA hadn't really worked well together. We acted more like competitors than allies. But in doing that, it also speaks to our millennial crowd with the messaging about buy a fish, save a tree. What they support, where my generation is more likely to buy farm-raised. Another thing we have been working on, and actually the industry and hobby developed the technology to reproduce corals and gave that to the zoos and aquariums. So in Bali and in Fiji and in several other source countries, corals are farmed in offshore sites by the hectare. Recently in Indonesia, coral farming was shut down by the Ministry of Fisheries, Susie, who just didn't believe in it. She didn't think that we should exploit her natural resources. So the coral farms were shut down. 12,000 people were put out of work. And unfortunately, the coral restoration efforts by those farmers stopped. 10% of what they produce was given to the government for coral restoration efforts. So this past Wednesday, she was just replaced. So we're hopeful that fishery will open up again. So when we're coral farming or when we're collecting from around the reefs, it's our job to protect the reefs, because we want to have those, we want to be able to come back and fish off that area again and again and again. So we limit how much we take. And obviously for overfishing, we stop doing that and leave it alone and let it repopulate and come back. But it also supports the livelihoods of people that are the transportation of the animals. When they're fishing also, they're protecting not just the fish, they're protecting the corals, because the fish have got to have those corals in order to thrive. So So not every fish that is in the trade, or not every fish is commercially viable. And a lot of fish around the world are under pressure due to pollution or invasive species like Lake Victoria and Nile perch. Most of the fish that are in Lake Victoria are into extinction events because they can't survive the invasive species. So our hobby is taking a lot of these not commercially viable animals and arc them, where they're breeding them. They're not real pretty, but they're making sure that if the fish are ever able to be repopulated, that they can be. So what we've done so far, within PJAC, we created best management practices for aquatic wholesalers, because we want people to try to do better, try to be better, get out and do those vendor audits, make sure that you know where your fish are coming from. We've been involved in a lot of litigation, both on ESA listings, with NOAA, with Hawaii, lobbying efforts, and organizing the hobby. And where we can still improve is transparency. Even though my company we tour, we're open to the public, and we tour about 200 people a month. A lot of other places don't want you to come in their facility and see what they're doing. I think that's a mistake. And of course, we can always do better with education and public outreach. I think, we are busy running our businesses, and so we don't always take the time that maybe we should to reach out and tell our story better. So I know that the issues we're facing, I know that other animal categories face as well, and I appreciate the chance to be able to speak to you. And that's all I have. Any questions?